are like, some are really easy to change. Like you can paint, your room a different color. But then some are really hard to change, like adding new foundations to your house, really hard. And so, that just relates so strongly to how I think about Bitcoin in terms of layers. Like, Bitcoin being this foundation layer, in my mind, I'm thinking about forever. I'm thinking about like, urban form timescales of thousands of years.
Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value, a place for asking questions about freedom, money, and creativity. My guest today is Paul Knight, a city planner and architectural designer at Historical Concepts in New York. Paul serves as the Director of Research at the Doug Allen Institute, a non-profit organisation exploring the lessons of history for how we can build better cities. Paul is also a Bitcoin enthusiast and has a deep interest in how money and economic forces shape the form of cities. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I had the chance to read an early version of your upcoming project, the Urban Form Standard. You write, "Cities are not just their buildings, though we often think of them that way, nor are cities just its people. Rome had a population of 1 million in the 1st century after Christ, but after the empire collapsed, that number plummeted to 60,000. The population didn't reach 1 million again until 1950. The buildings changed, the people changed, the entire civilization changed, yet it was still Rome." Paul, what persisted? What is the actual substance of a city that allows it to maintain its function across time?
Oh my goodness. Well, since this is a hour-long podcast, can I give you the long answer?
Go for it.
So most of my understanding of cities comes from my former professor at Georgia Tech, Doug Allen. And he said that, to answer the question, what are cities? There are two orders. There's the constitutional order and the representational order. The representational order is all the stuff that you kind of think of when you think of a city. The buildings, the people, cars, traffic, restaurants. But those things come and go. Like you just said, with Rome over 2,000 years. But the constitutional order is the underlying framework of all of that. So it's the streets, boundary lines, public parks, public buildings, and monuments. It's this political and public framework. Those are the things that last through time. They can persist for hundreds of years, and in Rome's case, thousands of years. Because they're public elements, each subsequent generation adopts them and kind of uses them or maintains them. And so they have this incredible staying power. And so, when I think of cities, I tend to think of cities down at that level. They're operating, through time at that level. All the other stuff, me and you and this airstream that I'm in, these things are only going to last for so long, but cities, the framework of cities will last forever.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you write, unlike private buildings, which often deteriorate between owners, public streets tend to get better with age, right?
Right. Yeah. Again, you can, if you think of a street, and when I say street, I don't mean, the thing you drive on, like asphalt. I mean the legal definition of a street, the public right of way. If you look at it on a plat, it's just a really boring drawing. It's two parallel lines, and they're, separated by 60 feet, or scaled, on the drawing. And within that 60 feet, it could be a rutted out dirt road in Idaho, or it could be, an urban thoroughfare in New York City. But it's that same dimension that can grow and adapt over time. New York didn't start off being New York City. It was just kind of this, rolling hills and farmland.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, there is a difference, I guess, as Doug Allen writes, between the representative and constitutional order of the streets. But I mean, the streets themselves do get better over time because that public good role, I guess you could say. And so this is an interesting question. Like, what is the relationship here between that public infrastructure and the idea of a public good, and in a sense planning as well? Because you mentioned New York, which very famously had the 1811 Commissioner's Plan for Manhattan, which you write about, which envisaged a city to be built over 1,000 years, and they sort of laid the grid for that, even though it was farmland pretty much at the time. And over time, that grid allowed enough flexibility that you could have skyscrapers as well. And so talking a little bit about that, I guess the idea of these boundaries and how they can, I guess, how we can conceptualize what they mean in the role of city planning.
Yeah, so these boundary lines, they create the structure that organizes everything. Beyond, it's not just a bunch of individuals, coming into a territory and doing everything on an individual basis. It's, they form a collective body, and that body decides, okay, we're going to roll this grid, up the island of Manhattan. And, because it was formed through this public body, it has this public ownership, and that allows it to persist over time. I think in terms of cities, I think of cities in terms of layers. So, the bottom layer is these boundary lines that we're talking about, and the streets forming these privately owned blocks, and then everything else, is built on top of that layer. And so, I tend to think that like regulation should be weighted on that bottom layer, and then slowly give way to the individual. So like collective at the bottom and individual at the top. Because if I were going to design a new city today, I would put so much time and effort in laying out that initial plan. And then I wouldn't care as much about, what color are the houses, or, what style of architecture are we going to use, or, whatever. Just because I'm not thinking in terms of the next 20 years or even 100 years. I'm thinking in terms of the next 1,000 years. And we've kind of gotten away from that. Now we've kind of flipped it where we're all, oh, we got to make sure, they don't paint their house pink or something, and we'll write that into a zoning ordinance. But then, we won't design a coherent street network, and we've got just suburban sprawl everywhere.
Yeah, well, I think this is worth dwelling on a little bit, because there is this interesting tension, and especially when I guess you look at it, for us as Bitcoiners as well, looking at it from this idea of like private property, the role of regulatory bodies and stuff, I think there can be maybe some gut feelings that somehow central planning doesn't work here. But really what you're saying, I think, makes sense, this tension where, you need to have a city that centrally the grid of it is thoughtful, and the greatest cities in the world tend to have that. Places like New York that you mentioned, places like Kyoto here in Japan, most cities, at least in the New World, have some degree of planning going on. And for those that don't, it can be really hard. It's really hard to get around. It can be congestion, all these issues. But when it comes to centrally planned cities, there is this idea that there's an anti-humanism there. And I think maybe if we could talk about that a little bit, because you have places like Brasilia in Brazil, you've got Canberra in Australia, these massive, almost authoritarian kind of sprawling cities that have this kind of centrally planned kind of top-down view. Yeah. And what is the difference between that and what we're talking about here with a street map, effectively?
Yeah, no, I think it's just an unfortunate, aspect of top-down planning. Sometimes it works amazingly well. Paris, New York, Chicago, these great street frameworks. But then, like you said, with Brasilia, sometimes it's just a disaster. And so I hate to say it, but is it the luck of the draw? I guess. Are you going to get a great city planner and end up with a great city, or?
Well, we can take some of the luck out of it though, because you do in the urban form standard that you're working on, you do write a little bit about some of the rules that we can look at here. So I think maybe talking a little bit about that. I mean, what is important to take into account when we're talking about cities, when we're reflecting on what makes a good city?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's super simple. There's 4 little rules that if you follow these rules, you'll create a foundation for urbanism that will last you for thousands of years. It's not a guarantee that your city is going to be amazing or beautiful or last 1,000 years, but it is a necessary framework in order to get to that point. So what I've done through this research project that started under Doug Allen, and I've just continued it to today, is, instead of trying to come up with my own idea of, what do I want a city to be, or, what should be the ideal city? Instead, I just ask the question, what do you think the ideal city is? And what does the APA think the ideal city is? And what is Fodor's and like all these travel journals or travel guides, what do they say the most amazing cities are? So I compiled a long list of objectively great cities around the world, and then I just measured them. I looked at their street networks, I measured their block sizes, measured their right-of-way widths. Do they have alleys or not? What are their block geometries? And you would think that, I'm pulling from all over the world. Every continent, every state in the United States. I intentionally want it to be very broad, in this. And amazingly, they all coalesce onto this really, really tight range of dimension that forms this foundation for good urbanism. So block sizes tend to be somewhere between 200 feet and 600 feet. They tend to be more rectangular than square because rectangulars geometries just happen to be easier to work with. I mean, the room that you're in looks like a rectangle, and all those books behind you are rectangles, and my computer screen is a rectangle. So rectangles are fairly useful forms for us, and there's this kind of stacking efficiency that compounds from scale to scale to scale, and so it just so happens that great blocks happen to be rectangular just because that's how it works for us. And so it's really just teasing out all these natural evolutions of things and rules of thumb and just kind of codifying them into these 4 simple rules.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I mean, the New York example, and how again that they didn't know about skyscrapers really to the degree that we have today. I mean, there were some larger structures there, but certainly the grid, these rectangular grids, 200 to 600 feet in size, were able to accommodate, and they were very flexible with that. And so I think about this. It is a case that all cities are planned to some degree.
It's just absolutely.
It's just a question of whether that plan is consistent and capable of expanding, or whether it's chaotic and constrained. And again, I think of cities that have more of a laissez-faire kind of thing going on, and the trains don't work, or you can't even build train networks. You can't have these kind of connective tissues that bring the different neighborhoods together, whereas at least some sort of blueprint for a city enables that to come through, right?
Well, something that really surprised me in my studies of all of this, and I'm not just looking at the urban design aspect of things like the dimensions. I'm also reading zoning ordinances and like boring stuff like that. But if you look at an aerial photograph of like suburban sprawl, you tend to think, oh, this is totally unplanned. They just kind of did whatever they wanted. Absolutely not the case. suburban sprawl is the most planned urbanism in America. Every inch of suburban sprawl is in a zoning ordinance, and you can't do anything without referencing that document.
Yeah, and I reflect, where I live here in Japan, Paul. We've got convenience stores, we've got small shops, small cafes all around, and it's really lovely. I don't own a car. I don't want to own a car. I love walking. I love biking, and it makes it a very livable human city. The same can be said about places like New York or Wellington and New Zealand, different cities I've lived in, and there's something beautiful about that. I mean, you can use a car if you want. You can go out and do stuff, but having the base mode as a very human-centric, human-scaled place. And I think just coming back to our reflections on Brasilia, Canberra, these public apartment projects, some very famous ones, Pruitt Ego, some of the work of Le Corbusier, it's very, it's not scaled to the person. And, you've got these wide boulevards and these massive structures. And I think that reveals something maybe about the nature of the planner who sort of sees the person as insignificant. But,
absolutely.
What does it mean to have a city that's scaled for people, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's Robert Moses. He was the big planner of New York in the 50s. I think he said, I hate people, but I love the public. He was just operating up here at the top and just kind of looking down at everybody and planning these big plazas and mega highways that just cut through neighborhoods, without thinking about what it actually means to be human, like within that city. And I found that with a lot of planners, they actually don't really have a sense of scale. And what I mean by that is, you can look at a map of a place. Let's just stick with New York City, and that'll be like on a 24 by 36 inch sheet of paper, and you've got the whole city laid out in front of you. And at that scale, it's impossible to even see the things that you interact with on a daily basis. The blocks are like these tiny, tiny little things. And that's the scale that Robert Moses was, working at when he was, planning all this, big highway infrastructure. The human scale is surprisingly really, really small. Yeah. And so as a city planner, architectural designer, I, really try to understand everything from, the super big scale all the way down to the scale of a doorknob or,
Well, there is I think what is termed as a terminal unit, sort of the smallest size you get to, which effectively is going to be a person who's, 5 to 6 feet tall, basically. That's the scale that we come down to. And so whether it's a skyscraper or a house, doors, door handles, seats, these kinds of things are going to be the same scale, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And you mentioned Robert Moses, who, again, it's important that, if we distinguish this, because there was the 1811 Commissioner's Plan for Manhattan, and then come through time to the 1950s, 1960s. Robert Moses in New York after World War II was saying, okay, we need to change things, and that was these highways and these massive changes to the original plan, which was very disruptive at the time. It sort of was like amputating limbs in a way, because he was laying these highways through New York, in a lot of cases cutting up communities. And there's a really good book, I don't know if you've read it, Vanishing New York, Jeremiah Moss, reflecting on how a great city lost its soul, and this idea of gentrification, from Robert Moses through to, I think it was Bloomberg, one of the mayors in like the early 2000s, who sort of really tried to develop the city beyond, I guess, what it was prior to that. And it was a lot of sort of tweaking of zoning laws, a lot of tweaking of sort of what sort of things could be built. And so you ended up with this monoculture that is maybe emblematic of New York today. I mean, I'd like to hear what you think, but, a little bit more sterile than it was in the earlier days.
Yeah, no, I hate to say it, but, buildings only last for so long, as we've, started this podcast, talking about. And, I'll look at these beautiful skyscrapers built in the early 1900s. At some point, they're just not going to be there anymore. And you can see like slowly 1960s architecture, 1970s, like these monolithic, bland, typical downtown America or even international, buildings just kind of popping up everywhere.
Yeah, well, that said, though, I mean, I think there's kind of a certain period of time where a building does become untouchable. And I think, say, New York, it would be hard to get rid of those heritage-listed buildings, which arguably, is that a good thing or not? It's hard to say. But certainly there was some beautiful structures. And the one that strikes me is it Penn Station?
Penn Station,
yeah. I mean, you talk a little bit about that movement and how that really started this preservationist idea, perhaps?
Yeah, so Pennsylvania Station was designed by McKim Eden White. I think it was in early or late 1800s. And it was this beautiful, monumental, Beaux-Arts, classical train station.
In New York, yeah.
In New York City. And I believe it was torn down in the 60s to make way for, a big new development, and they built a new Penn Station that, just looked like total crap. And so I can't remember who said this, but somebody said, we used to enter the city like gods, now we scurry in like rats. And it's just so oppressive, like the old Penn Station, like low ceilings, and it's just really bad. And when everybody saw that, they were like, oh shit, we've got to protect some of our really amazing buildings that we have here. And so, yeah, that prompted this preservation movement, really to kind of transfer these, very publicly important buildings into the care of the public so that it can persist through time.
Yeah, so there's an interesting tension here. And I mean, again, it's not a simplistic black or white, yes or no, private, public. I think, maybe you'd agree that there is a tension here where something like the central train station of a city really, beyond who actually owns it, in some cases it can be private, but I think it does have this public role. People pass through it. And so there's also a tension there with something like the fixed street map, the master plan, not just being fully, tabula rasa, you can build anything. There is these key pockets and these things that will merge. And it's almost like this is sort of a layer 2 on top of the base layer, right, that actually starts to give character to what would otherwise be just the constitutional representation, right?
Right, yeah, just kind of this meaningless, grid or meaningless Excel file. And until you actually start putting things in there, it doesn't mean anything.
Well, it's interesting because I'm reminded of, I don't know, have you ever been to Tokyo before, Paul?
No, but it is on my, top 3 list of places to travel next.
Yeah, well, I'll show you around sometime. But it's interesting with Tokyo, again, there's kind of the old city. There's kind of some sense of sprawl beyond it, though. There was quite a degree of planning involved. But certainly what happened, unfortunately, during World War II, it was mostly burnt to the ground. And so the entire grid, the structure of these wooden houses got burnt away. And there was this great rush after the war to rebuild the city. And in a sense, it's sort of a symptom of fiat money as well, which I hope we'll get into in a moment. But they're very quick, and there was this disposability. And so the structure, it's a very ugly city, I must say. It's got its own sense of beauty in the kind of the way it's been built up, that there's still moments of quietness and solitude, but it's not a great architectural city because everything got blown away, and that sort of has persisted through time. And so it is a grey concrete jungle, whereas somewhere like Kyoto or where I live in Kamakura, so it was never bombed to the same degree. And so it has just this little bit more texture. And, the great cities of the world have these kind of architectural epochs that kind of populate it. It's kind of like having a family with, grandparents, parents, grandchildren, all of these generations in one place, right?
You mentioned fiat money. So, we could go into that a little bit because, yeah, like since the 60s, really, or post World War II. I mean, similar in New York City, all the buildings are starting to look like crap. And even in my only 20 years of experience in the construction industry, I've actually seen a decline in quality of construction, just even in within that time. And I mean, you and all of your listeners, know about the ravages of inflation, and that makes itself, known in the decrease in quality of construction. Just thinking about, pre-World War II architecture was, built more slowly, built more fine-grained, not just architecture, but also urbanism. And then post World War II, you get this like jump in scale where everything just gets, like overblown. Like you start working on these big projects, big maps, big buildings, and it's this, economy of scale. It's like, oh, well, I can't afford to do the small, little mom and pop shop now. Now I've got to be, a family office that has a ton of money and buys up a lot of property, and the numbers only pencil out if I get, X number of units. And, suddenly you've just got this monolithic thing, and, oh, I don't want to pay for, the beautiful window surrounds that you would see on, a lot of these buildings in the early 1900s. I've got to make more money than that, so we're just not going to do any window surrounds.
Yeah, well, I wonder. I think at a simplistic level, there is an argument that there is the kind of direct relationship between the nature of money and urban form, and this kind of mythical idea, perhaps, of the golden age. And I think that's maybe a little bit problematic in when you look at it, real close. I think there's a lot more wrapped into it. I think there's ideological change. I think there's, certainly the pre-war, post-war split, as far as my studies reveal, is this kind of internationalism that emerged after the war, which was trying to go towards a kind of a clean, more communicative future. And the example for me is like the typeface Helvetica, which people might be familiar with. This emerged as this kind of new internationalism out of Switzerland, I think. This new typeface, sans serif, very clean, easy to read. And you compare that with sort of the way they were doing writing before, these kind of very complex serif characters. For me, that's an example that has also transmuted over into architecture. And so the kind of classic 1950s, 1960s glass tower, in a sense at the time, it was a utopianism, it was a future focus, right? And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, sort of how you see that maybe ideological difference between the old and the new.
Yeah, so when I went through architecture history class, they would say, why do we have all these different architectures, all these different styles? Well, there's different climates, around the world, hot weather, cold weather, that you're going to need a different kind of building. That's going to, translate into a different kind of architecture. What materials are available? What's the technology? That's been a big one, of this previous 100 years is post-industrial revolution. I mean, technology has dramatically changed things. I mean, even AC units has changed how architecture looks, and also like where you can build. And so, we learned about all these different things that affect how we build our homes and cities, but we never learned about the monetary system. We never learned about inflation or the gold standard or any of that. So I'm with you in my research. I haven't seen some like clean, these like clean variables that relate to money, and then because of this, therefore it translates into architecture and urbanism this way. But I do think it's just one of the other like many factors that considered all together, it does shape and affect the built environment.
Well, I think maybe also at a higher level, the economic order, and coming back to New York, I think it was Bloomberg, Mike Bloomberg, sorry, Mike Bloomberg, the businessman, former mayor of New York City. So he really had this idea of like, let's bring more Wall Street, let's internationalize, let's globalize New York, and this I guess was like the early 2000s, and it really changed the face of the city. It became a city of big money. And I think that this is maybe what we're getting at, this idea of like BlackRock or these massive hedge funds, they kind of own everything, they're buying everything up. And that to me is a symptom of, the Cantillon effect, this late stage project we're in where, effectively it's all been gobbled up by these large entities. And that, I think, more than anything has an impact. So it's not necessarily like the architects are somehow being changed in what they want to do.
Yeah.
They're being constrained, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, typically architects don't have a ton of money, so we're not the ones like funding these projects. We have clients, and they're the ones that write the checks. So if the client wants a big boxy building, then the architect is going to make them that.
What makes the box though? And I mean, again, I'm in this. I go into Tokyo once a week, and the original Tokyo station is a beautiful brick building. It survived World War II. I think it's one of the greatest pieces of architecture in the city, and that is contrasted with that's the financial district. There's all of these glass towers that look exactly the same, and you've got these two epochs face to face. And I wonder, what is it about the nature of the economic order, the desire to sort of put this money and deploy it in the most efficient way? There's this kind of, I don't know, because like ornate Beaux-Art and sculptures and that sort of thing, they're not an economic use of money. They're a very decorative thing. And like, how did we get to that place where we don't consider that,
I ask myself that question all the time. I mean, I'm walking around and I'll see, some little apartment building, but it's got the most beautiful entry, door surround. And I'm just thinking, how did the developer at that time say to themselves, you know what, I'm going to spend all this extra money to make this beautiful door surround for this little apartment building? And now, with these large buildings, so we call it spreadsheet architecture. With these developers, they have their work down to a science. I mean, they've got these Excel sheets, these proformas, and they itemize everything. And really that largely drives the form of these buildings. Like there's not a line item in there for door and window, exterior stone surrounds. It's just not in there. And so, when the developer hands that spreadsheet over to, the architect, then, the architect is just going to use these systems. Oh, and that's another thing actually is we don't build buildings anymore. We install them.
Oh, yeah.
So, back in the day, you would have like actual builders on site, like making the pieces and putting the pieces and connecting the pieces together to make the building. And even like windows would be made like on site. Nowadays, all of that has been largely driven away. You order your windows from a manufacturer. You'll order trim from a manufacturer. Everything is a component that is brought onto site, and you just kind of stick it up and nail it in, and boom, you're done.
Yeah.
And so it's the same with these skyscrapers too.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There's this idea I was introduced to recently, value engineering. I don't know if you've come across that. And it's funny.
Yeah.
It's a euphemism, but it's It's not really a euphemism. I mean, it's used very seriously as this idea of like, well, how can we minimize costs by value engineering? And just hearing someone say that with a straight face, I was like, well, you're just literally trying to cut corners.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's. I mean, that's the world we live in. And like, what does that mean? I think this is maybe getting on to the next question, was really looking at the critique of, I guess, what we call modernity, because this kind of, beyond the materiality of the structure, the economic order, the nature of money is going to affect, I guess, the dominant ideological framework that we're working within. And where we're at today, this kind of modernity, this even neoliberal project that we're in right now, it doesn't maybe appreciate the finer things, if I can put it that way. And I guess, I mean, how do you look at things? Because I know certainly your work with historical concepts is looking back at this and the older way of doing things. But like, where are you at with understanding modernity and what that is?
Yeah, well, just thinking in terms of my professional career, as an architect, in order to pursue those finer things, and so when I think of finer things, I think of like the actual like love and care into the details and the construction. Unfortunately, it just costs a hell of a lot of money to do that. And I mean, I'm fortunate to work at a firm where we have a lot of clients that have a lot of money. And so, we can entertain those ideas and, really, take these historical concepts and actually apply them and dig into those details. But from a personal perspective, I've been, thinking about wanting to build a house, and, I'm not my clients. I don't have all this money. And so I'm thinking, how do I build this in a way that is, respectful of my, skills as an architectural designer and the history and everything, but is also affordable, but then is also, capable of, it's not just a cheap house, not just like going out and buying the cheapest materials and then hope that the house lasts for 50 years. How can you do that durably? And it's hard. I've been reaching out to builders and they're just like, not interested. So it's either they only want to, work on the, really big, expensive stuff with bigger budgets, or, they're just not interested in that affordable word and for custom designed, and so therefore it just kind of gets relegated to prefab buildings or mobile homes or something that
they just want to install a house, right?
They just
yeah. Well, man, I don't know. Again, I guess I do want to come back though to this idea that I think there is a simplistic critique that modernity is ugly, that it's wrong, that it's not good, and I think we can be more nuanced and sophisticated than that, and we can look at where this came from. There was obviously a major turning point in the 20th century, which was World War II, and that, I think we can look at that as really where a lot of the old things, arguably the First World War as well, but certainly there was like the old way, and then there was the new internationalist order, and that it seems to be that is what is part underneath all of this, almost beneath the street map, beneath the city plan. There's almost a layer zero, which is the economic order. And I think, somewhere like New York, it was planned in that earlier time, and so it was able to kind of grow and expand. But it came from a place of, I guess, abundance and that, the golden age.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I haven't thought about that before. Thinking about Le Corbusier. So, he was a French or Swiss architect.
French-Swiss, maybe. Yeah,
French-Swiss.
Yeah.
He kind of gets a bad rap. I mean, I'm no fan of Le Corbusier or his designs or his ideas or any of that. But if you read his book, City of Tomorrow, you'll see like he's referencing a lot of other people's work, and he's referencing a lot of things that are already happening. The cars and this economic streamlining the numbers and technology, plate glass windows, steel, skyscrapers, elevators. Even though he was a promoter of all of that, he was also just kind of riding the wave of something that was already happening. And you're right, like within that kind of framework, you might not get the plan of New York City out of that. You might just get suburban sprawl, which is what we've been getting.
That's interesting as well with Le Corbusier in particular. If you look at his earlier work, he designed a lot of like churches, and he's got these classic images of I think there's like he's got like people and then these like circles that kind of represent the different shapes, like a sitting person, a standing person, someone lying down. And like he's done all of these studies. I've had a look at one of his books, or a book on his work.
The modular.
The modular. There's this kind of idea that it would be very human scaled, and especially the residential design. But then I guess later on, and some of these more grand plans for the future, they took on this larger kind of project of building grand, sprawling cities.
So many of the greatest modernist architects actually started off as like classical architects, or studying like the small scale designs, and so now, like when you go through architecture school now, everybody's a modernist. There's very few traditional classical architecture programs out there, but they don't have the benefit of having that 12,000 years of architecture and urban history to draw from, because to them it's just kind of like this clean, no, we're just going to start from post-industrial revolution and on. We're not going to concern ourselves for human scale and all of that.
Well, you write in this project, the Urban Form Standard, Roman architect Vitruvius didn't invent the column orders. He documented what Greek builders had refined over centuries. Medieval cathedral builders didn't calculate flying buttresses from first principles. They learned from the successes and failures of previous cathedrals. Precedent was teacher, textbook, and proof rolled into one.
Absolutely. And I live by that every day. I always start with precedent. And you naturally, that's not to be like, oh, I'm lazy, or I don't have any good ideas, or, whatever. It's, you just pull from what has worked before. And then by the very nature of, whatever project comes your way, or, whatever town you're working with, those variables will affect the things that you just gathered. So you will develop like a new, novel, contemporary thing.
Well, I think this is, come back to the critique of modernity, which is, again, it's a very, it's an extension of rational thought, of the Enlightenment, I guess. This idea that a theory can be internally consistent, mathematically elegant, but completely divorced from human reality. And we look at these cities that have worked for centuries. They've been tested by millions of people who have lived there. They've chosen to make it their home. And that's kind of like a real evidence. And so I think it maybe reflects the great scientism of the age that we live in, that, we can actually design people's lives, that we can become, in a sense, reflect the machinery of society through the design of places. And I think that comes back to a deeper ideological change. I think that somehow people's lives can be preordained and kind of
manipulated and controlled, and
it's like populations and flows of people and stuff like that.
You mentioned Pruitt-Igoe. That's an example of top-down planning that was not based on any precedent of how, of design or otherwise, how people actually behave, or where people want to be, or that, was designed, kind of like Brasilia, just from 10,000 feet, looking down. And in Pruitt-Igoe, I think that was in St. Louis, and I
Yeah.
think it was built in the 50s, somewhere around there. It performed so poorly that they tore it down 20 years later.
Yeah.
And, a lot of that, I think the elevators would only stop every third floor. They were like, oh, we can be more efficient or something with the elevators. And, taking Le Corbusier's idea of the tower in a park where, gosh, if we don't have all these little houses around and we just put everybody into one big tower, then, everything else can be this beautiful green space. And, that sounds like a good idea. And that could even look like a good idea in a plan view, because you'd have a lot of green and everybody loves to see a lot of green and a lot of trees. But then the problem is, well, whose green is that? It's like this weird amorphous, semi-public, semi-private green space. There's no place for you to like kind of, sit along the edge and like look in. People like to like think about the cute little piazzas and plazas like in Italy or something, and that are small and that everybody likes to occupy the perimeter and kind of look at the theater of life happening on the inside. Well, then
Yeah.
if you blow that scale up, even if there is a perimeter, you can't see anything that's happening
Yeah.
internally. So
Well, I mean, it's interesting as well with Pruitt Ego in particular, the architect Minoru Yamasaki. It's also very famous for the original Twin Towers, the World Trade Center design, and this kind of this emblem of really internationalism of 1970s modernity with these structures and sort of what they mean. There's actually a film I've been meaning to watch, which is the myth of Pruitt Ego, which sort of goes into some of the decline of that place. But look, I mean, we've been exploring this idea of like architecture of places. I mean, keen to maybe just talk a little bit about Bitcoin as well, man, because I know this is a big thing for you. You're a Bitcoin enthusiast. Like, how did you get interested in Bitcoin?
Oh man, I should have been interested at the beginning. I mean, because it's, it checks all the boxes of things I'm interested in: computers, mathematics. I've always been interested in money, not necessarily making money, but just kind of like the idea of money and collecting coins. When I was growing up, and so I should have known about it in 2010, but it wasn't until 2016 that I was actually I was living in Atlanta at the time, but in New York City for an award thing, and I just happened to walk by a storefront that said Bitcoin accepted here, and I thought, oh, what's Bitcoin? And I got home and I started reading about it, and that prompted, I would say, a solid like 5 years of non-stop reading and learning about Bitcoin. I just couldn't get enough.
Wow.
And yeah, so ever since 2016, I've just been metaphorically all in on Bitcoin.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's incredible. And I guess, I mean, for me and you as well, as creative people, I think something about there's a beauty to it, right? Like, I really think it's got an elegance that maybe is hard to describe. Like, how do you describe money as elegant or beautiful? But I mean, it is, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, the way I've come to think about it, I think I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, thinking about cities in terms of layers. Well, then I also read this book by Stuart Brand called How Buildings Learn. And in that book, he, also talks about how buildings are a number of different components. So you've got like the structure, the foundation, different types of rooms, plumbing, electrical, all of that. But all of those change at different rates and are like, some are really easy to change. Like you can paint, your room a different color. But then some are really hard to change, like adding new foundations to your house, really hard. And so he described buildings as layers also. And so that just relates so strongly to how I think about Bitcoin in terms of layers. Like, Bitcoin being this foundation layer, people will criticize it as, it's like, oh, Bitcoin's so boring. You can't do anything with it. Where are my smart contracts and all this kind of stuff? But, in my mind, I'm thinking about forever. I'm thinking about, like, urban form timescales of thousands of years. I want that base layer to be as rock solid and as dumb and boring as possible. I want that to be like the strongest foundation possible for what you're going to build on top of it.
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting about that relationship between the idea of a city, the blocks, and that's something Michael Saylor's talked about, I think, as well. Like, property in Manhattan, and the analogy, I think, is quite clear that these blocks, literally blocks that we have with every 10 minutes in Bitcoin, and then you can fill them with things, but the format and the structure of that is set in stone, and there's something quite profound about that, and especially when you look at the looseness of central bank monetary policy and the whims of the market and this kind of over financialization of the way money works. It's like, okay, you start to see deep down, it's hard to maybe express through language, but you can feel maybe the relationship there, and maybe a sense of unease with the way the world is. And I think, we do need to be nuanced about this. I don't think I don't know if we can point a finger at one particular thing and say this is the issue, but certainly you can feel that there's a connection there, and I think that's quite attractive, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I even this was a while back. I made a diagram using New York City as a way to represent how big Satoshi is. And I can't quite remember what the dimension is, but I added up all the areas of the private blocks of New York City. You divide that area by 21 million, and you end up with, I think maybe it's like 3.7 feet on a side, like a little square, and that represents a Satoshi, or maybe that represents a whole Bitcoin. I can't remember.
Maybe Satoshi.
Yeah, but thinking about it, in those terms, it also helps to, think of the scale of that 21 million, like if, you own your little Bitcoin, like what does that look like in terms of Manhattan? And then it's just like this tiny little thing, and it's like, oh, well, yeah, wow.
Well, I'm interested in, so just on that topic, so obviously you're at this interesting place in between architecture, very interested in Bitcoin, and in particular with your architectural work, you're very much looking at the way things were done before, what you could call maybe a lower time preference. In terms of your reading, your own study on these topics, is there anything that stood out to you as really inspiring your outlook on whether it's money, architecture, society? Like, what are you reading, or what have you read that's sort of left an impression?
Recently, I read Alan Bertaude's book, Order Without Design: How Markets Shape Cities. I wish I'd read that 2 decades ago. Such an amazing book, and really captured as you learn about architecture and cities, I'm always just thinking about it, and there's like in the back of my mind, there's this list of questions that I always have, like, oh, why is it that way, or why doesn't this work, and Bertaude in his book, he really gets at, like, he kind of looks at all those different factors, the technology, social structures, and politics, and economics, and in the book he shows how they all affect cities, and so that was a big one.
That sounds interesting.
No, I would recommend it. And then also Ed Glazer's book, I think it's called The Triumph of the City. So that's one, you'll encounter people that say, I would never want to live in a city, or, cities are just skyscraper canyons, and it helps to have like a lot of the talking points that Ed Glazer has from his book to respond, to people like that. He just helped me see how cities can, help solve the problem of, sustainability, or, suburban sprawl. There's not a lot of people out there that like suburban sprawl, but then through their actions, they kind of indirectly create it. And so that book also helps you see the connection between like those, kind of zoning concept and how that translates into the sprawl concept.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting space here. I mean, just overall, certainly your writing is really fascinating, but this idea of like the collision of like money and economic forces and cities, I think is really interesting. I'd certainly love to see more Bitcoiners or more people who are sort of interested in Bitcoin share their thoughts on that, because I'm from the countryside. I grew up in a sprawling place, and I tell you, cities are, they are a culture hub for a reason. There's an energy there. There's a dynamism when you get people together and you have these these
network
encounters.
Effects.
Yeah, there's a network effect, and I think they get a bad rap. Maybe people's experience of a particular city. Maybe it was one that's it hasn't followed the 4 rules that you mentioned earlier. It's huge blocks, and you have to drive everywhere. But for a city that is actually human scaled, it can be an incredible place. Certainly, one of my foundational readings is The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand. I don't know if you've read that, but the story of Howard Rourke, the young up-and-coming architect, really struck a chord with me. Most people are familiar with Atlas Shrugged. It's more of a well-known, I guess, and maybe out in some circles, but certainly The Fountainhead stood out to me as just a beautiful piece of writing. It's very emotive, and sort of speaking from this, I think it was written in the 1940s, and so it was right at that turning point between kind of the old and the new.
The old and the new, yeah.
So look, Paul, we've talked about quite a different topics here. There's one final sort of aspect I want to touch on with regards to cities, and so again, maybe people who haven't worked in this space, they haven't, they're not super familiar with it. We've been talking about planning of cities and sort of the nuance there that, it is important to have a master street plan that can then be filled with many things that are maybe not so specifically zoned to, enable a free market there, but, some sense of structure similar to Bitcoin's rules. But when it comes to this idea of the 15-minute city, which has become very it's kind of a bit of a meme at this point. How do we think about this? Because in a sense, this is like a perversion of everything we've talked about as a control structure. But tell me about what you see 15-minute cities mean. What have they been trying to achieve, and why? How can we think about them?
So I'm going to be honest. I haven't read like the book, or I haven't seen whatever Fox News or CNN or whatever is talking about the 15-minute city. But I have seen the rumblings about it on X. And I thought, what's wrong with the 15-minute city? Because to me, that's just kind of like just natural, like good urbanism. Like I live, I'm in Beacon, New York, which is this small little town, about an hour and a half train ride north of the city. And, beautiful, idyllic along the Hudson River. And it's got this great mile-long main street, beautiful building stock. It's just such a great scale. It's a 15-minute city. I can, everything I need is within a 15-minute walk of, so.
I live in a 15-minute city as well. I walk everywhere.
Yeah, so I don't get it.
I think what it is, to be clear, I think the word has been hijacked, though. I think, what we're talking about, good urbanism, that this 15-minute city, it is a euphemism, though, I think, for control structures to be put on cities. And you see this in the UK with these low emission zones where you can't drive a car, you can't do this, you can't do that. And it seems like it's a nice sounding word, and it sort of appeals to a kind of humanism or sort of urbanism, but actually the way it's being deployed is very top down, and I think that's maybe part of it. That there's somebody somewhere has these ideas that we can retrofit these cities to be like this.
I could definitely see. I mean, like everything is way over regulated. I mean, once something is written in a zoning ordinance or a subdivision regulation, it's really, really hard to get it out of there. And so, over these last 100 years of modern planning, at least here in America, zoning ordinances have gone from 10-page pamphlets to 800-page multi-volumes, and so if the 15-minute thing is about like over-regulation and like controlling those like top layers of your lives, like paint colors and things, then I'm all about that too. That's ridiculous.
And then again, man, I don't even know, because I think, as you say, I mean, this seems to be something that's come out of like the X, like echo chamber, maybe. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's not even a thing. I mean, I think at the very least, good urbanism. I mean, I think it's something we can all agree. It's when you live in a nice place, it's very nice, and you can go and walk down to the shops, and it's a very idyllic way of living. And I mean, maybe hey man, I don't know where this came from. Maybe I'm confused. Apparently, I just had a quick look, and apparently it's a far right conspiracy theory that this is even a thing. Okay. So man, I'm sorry. Maybe I'll put us on the watch list. But look, I think certainly reevaluating cities, having a look at what they mean and sort of how we live, and certainly how, if anything, how cars really dominate a lot of people's lives, I think is maybe the key piece here. It's not like, hey, you can't use your car, but it's like, man, it's not nice to be stuck in traffic, No, I don't think
cars have really, really impacted the built environment in more ways than I think people realize. I mean, it's, they take up, in a lot of cases, parking lots are larger than the buildings that they're serving. Like a 2-car garage, that's the size of a apartment. So they require a ton of space, and they can really eat away at, what these like good, universal principles of good urbanism.
Paul, what's your favorite city in the world?
Ooh. Okay, I'm going to have to give kind of a collection of answers for this, because I don't have like one favorite, because cities are never just, one thing. So the most beautiful city in the world, Paris. And that's a top-down plan.
Haussmann.
I mean, Haussmann. Haussmann's Paris. He affected everything from the land plan, but then the building facades, and even down to like there are designs for boot scrapers that you were supposed to install on your building. So I mean, he planned everything. Now that's a situation where you've got top down happening, and it produced Paris, which is great, not Brasilia. But on the other hand, even though Paris is this beautiful city, since Haussmann, people have tried to preserve it and really preserve it in like amber, and in effect they've made it to where the normal the hoi polloi can't live there. It's just a city for the ultra rich, because the 6-story height limits and all that. So it's like, who are we preserving Paris for? And so it's not like a real city. It's more of like this museum city, but beautiful city. And then, honestly, I love small town America. There's something about having these little grids and these beautiful turn of the century or like 1900s post offices and the park. And, it's like, to me, it's just like an ideal urbanism, small town
Yeah.
America.
What?
And I'm lucky to live in one.
Oh yeah. So small town America, and I'm imagining more eastern, like East Coast small town, or you find this anywhere?
Well, I guess you could find it anywhere. Like like when the railroads were expanding, and these railroad companies had these templates for towns, and they were just like, boom, these grids. And then, really there was a lot of like templates for the buildings, as well. So even, all out west, those are great. On the East Coast, you've got Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Look that up. Beautiful, Appalachian town, like along the river, right on the mountainside. So there's a lot more, I guess, variety, along the East Coast.
Yeah, that's incredible. Look, man, it's been really good to chat. So your plans, though, for 2025, you're obviously working with historical concepts, producing some of this original architecture informed by the classical tradition. You're involved with the Doug Allen Institute as well. What else is on your roadmap? Tell me a bit more about what's in store for you.
Focusing on the urban form standard. Right now I've got chapters 1 through 6 or 7 done. And, now I want to start digging into like the implementation of these rules, and to show like how, okay, we know what a master street plan is. We know how to design a master street plan. Well, how do we actually do it in our communities? So that's my next thing.
Awesome. And that's through the Doug Allen Institute? Is it part of that?
It is, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really awesome. Yeah, I had a good read through. It was very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you.
What you've got so far. Well, look, man, we might leave it there. If people want to follow you, they want to follow your work, where's the best place to send them?
I used to be a lot more active on X, but not so much anymore. But you can still find me there at PKMemex. And then I've also got a personal blog where I've started to collect a lot of my work. So you can go to alif.press. And then, DougAllenInstitute.org.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah, thank you so much.